حدث مفضع وخطب جرير دق عن مثله استبار الصبور قام نعي العلوم أجمع لما قام نعي محمد بن جرير.
After some time in Egypt, he returned to his homeland of Tabaristan, and then he traveled back to Baghdad, only to return to Tabaristan for a final time. While he was there, he authored the book Fadail al-Shaykhan, meaning Abu Bakr and Umar radiallahu anhum. And this angered some of the people who had tashayyu', and he had to leave Tabaristan for Baghdad in the year 290 Hijri. He remained in Baghdad until his death in 310 Hijri. It is interesting to note that Abu Ja'far ibn Jarir al-Tabari had studied the various madhahib prevalent in his time, except for the madhab of Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal. He learned the madhab of Imam al-Shafi'i from the students of Imam al-Shafi'i, specifically Imam al-Rabi' ibn Sulaiman, Imam al-Muzani, and Imam Yunus ibn Abd al-A'la. He learned the fiqh of Imam Malik from the students of Abdullah ibn Wahb, and he learned the fiqh of Imam Abi Hanifa from the Imam of Ar-Ray, Abu Muqatil. He had learned the fiqh of the Zahiriyyah from the founder of the madhab, Dawood ibn Ali al-Asbahani al-Zahiri, and he would often debate him. Ibn Jarir had in fact written a book refuting him entitled Ar-Rad ala Dhil Asfar. With all of this, Ibn Jarir was a mujtahid and had formulated his own madhab, and he had students that followed him but tried to codify his madhab and were not successful, and his madhab was not popular like the madhahib al-arba'. When the word spread of Ibn Jarir's diligence in seeking ilm, many students rushed to learn from him and narrate from him because of ulu as-sanad, meaning that he had a chain of narration that had the least individuals between him and the Prophet ﷺ. Having lived for 83 years, he spent his entire life since childhood seeking knowledge, and his classes and books were a testimony to his knowledge and intellect. Once, a person asked him about al-Urud, and he could not answer him, so he said, "I will speak to you tomorrow about this." Then he asked his friend to lend him the book al-Urud of al-Khaleel ibn Ahmed al-Farahidi. So he spent one night reading the book, and he said, "My friend brought it, and I read it that night, and I went into the night not knowing Urud, and the next morning I became Urudi," meaning that he was so well versed in the subject that he was able to teach it. Many students flocked to learn from him, and a few had adopted his madhab, such as Abu Shu'aib Abdullah ibn Hassan al-Harrani, al-Qadi Abu Bakr Ahmed ibn Kamil, who was the Qadi of Kufa, and Abu al-Faraj al-Mu'afa ibn Zakaria al-Nahrawani, and others like Imam Abu al-Qasim Sulaiman ibn Ahmed al-Tabarani, and Abu Ahmed Abdullah ibn Adi. They had also studied with Ibn Jarir and praised his knowledge and his books. Some of his students had even authored biographical books specifically detailing his life and efforts in seeking ilm. None of these biographical works have reached us in completion. However, portions have been cited in books like Mu'jam al-Udaba of Yaqoot Al-Hamawi, Inaabat al-Ruwaat of al-Qifthi, and Siyar A'lam al-Nubala of Imam Al-Dhahabi. And so they describe him physically as being tall and thin with dark skin. His eyes were wide and his beard was full and long, mostly black with some gray. His students talked about how he was a kind and caring person who gave attention to his students, visiting them when they were sick, supporting them financially when they were in need, and encouraging them in seeking knowledge and memorization. He would take notice if one of them was absent from his classes, and he would delay the class if the reader wasn't present, so that he would not have any gaps in his transmission of what was being read. He would often consult with his students on what they would read or study, and he would notice if they were struggling with the texts and the classes. Ahmed ibn Kamil was once insulted by one of the students of Ibn Jarir in one of his gatherings, and so he stopped attending the gathering for some time. Ibn Jarir approached him and apologized to him as if he was the one that insulted Ahmed ibn Kamil. And thereafter, Ibn Kamil returned to those majalis out of respect for his teacher, Ibn Jarir al-Tabari. Ibn Jarir loved to smell good perfume during his durus. He would often frequent the shops of the perfume sellers and purchase good scents, especially during the summertime. As a part of his daily routine, if he ate some food in the daytime, he would take a nap in a short-sleeved shirt made of linen that was perfumed with sandalwood and rosewater. Then he would wake up and pray dhuhr. Then he would sit and write until asr time. After he prayed asr, he would sit and read to the students, or they would read to him, and he would explain and teach until maghrib time. After praying maghrib, he would teach fiqh until the time of isha. Then he would return to his home after praying and splitting the night into prayer and recitation of the Quran and sleep. He was known for his good taste in food, except that he did not like the taste of dates or honey. He was well versed in medicine and considered a doctor in his time. However, he did not treat anyone but himself. Once he had fallen ill, and his close friend, the wazir or minister Ali ibn Isa, had sent a doctor to him to treat him. The doctor asked him about his condition, so Ibn Jarir explained his ailment and what he had done to treat himself. The doctor said, "I don't have any other recommendations beside what you have already done to treat yourself. By Allah, if you were among the followers of our way, then you would be regarded as one of the Hawariyin, or apostles." This illness was pleurisy, an inflammation of the tissues around the lining of the lungs and the chest cavity that causes chest pain with every breath. He began to lose his eyesight after the year 270 Hijri, but that did not prevent him from continuing to seek knowledge, teach, and write. His recitation of the Quran was beautiful. He was mutqin. He recited the Quran with precision. He would lead the Taraweeh prayer in Ramadan. The scholars of his time would make an effort to pray behind him in Ramadan because of the sweetness of his recitation. Abu Ali At-Tabari said, "During Ramadan, I used to take Abu Bakr ibn Mujahid to his masjid for Taraweeh prayer." We should mention that Abu Bakr ibn Mujahid was the Imam and the Sheikh of the Qurra, the author of As-Saa'iy fil Qira'at. So At-Tabari said, "On one of the last 10 nights, we left his home and we passed by his masjid and he didn't enter. He kept going until the end of Suq al-Atas. He stood at the door of the masjid of Muhammad ibn Jarir, and Ibn Jarir was reciting Surah Al-Rahman. He stood there listening to the recitation for a long time. Then he left. So I said to him, 'Ya Ustadh, you left the people waiting for you, and you came here to listen to this recitation?' He replied to me, 'Ya Aba Ali, leave it be. I did not think that Allah created a person that recites as beautifully as this recitation,' or something to this effect. Despite all the time that Ibn Jarir had dedicated to learning and teaching, he exerted himself in worshipping Allah and reading the Quran. He would read a quarter of the Quran every night and finish the entire Quran in just 4 nights. He did not care for the worldly pleasures, nor did he seek power or status. The Abbasi Khalifa, al-Muqtafi Billah, once told his minister Al-Hasan ibn Abbas, "I want to endow a book that compiles all the statements of the scholars, that they all agree upon its authenticity and correctness, free from any difference of opinion." So it was said to him, "No one is able to do that except Ibn Jarir." So they brought Ibn Jarir, who dictated the book for the Khalifa. After the book was written, the Khalifa rewarded him, and he refused to accept the reward. They insisted, "Either you accept this reward, or we fulfill a need that you have." So he said, "Yes, fulfill a need. I ask the Amir al-Mu'mineen, the leader of the believers, to ordain that the police prevent the beggars from entering the courtyard of the masjid to beg and hassle the worshippers on Yawm al-Jum'ah, the day of Jum'ah." The Khalifa and his ministers were amazed at how he asked for something that was for the general good of the public and not for himself. It is said that Ibn Jarir wrote his book Fada'il al-Abbas ibn Abd al-Muttalib at the request of some of the Abbasids in Iraq. Wallahu a'lam. We should highlight that the scholars have often authored books at the behest of the rulers, and this is not something strange or something that should be criticized. There are people who follow in the footsteps of the Orientalists and try to blemish the reputation of the scholars that wrote books when requested by the rulers or their ministers. They try to diminish the validity of such books by doubting the legitimacy because the book was written at the request of one of the rulers. They are attempting to turn people away from the contents of the book. This view and approach is absolutely batil. It is falsehood. It is misguided. It is in direct opposition to the way of the Salaf. Imam Malik ibn Anas had written his Muwatta at the request of the Abbasi Khalifa Abu Ja'far al-Mansur. So don't be fooled by these types of misguided statements about the scholars of the Salaf. Ibn Jarir was also a scholar of the highest level of integrity. The Abbasi minister Al-Abbas ibn al-Hussein had sent a request to Ibn Jarir asking him to write a summarized book in fiqh. So he authored the book Al-Khafif fi Ahkam Shara'i' al-Islam. This book is a summary of his larger book in fiqh called Latif al-Qawl. The minister was so impressed by the book that he had sent Ibn Jarir a gift of 1,000 dinars, which Ibn Jarir had refused to accept. He was told to take the money and then spend it in charity any way that he saw fit. So he said no. They, meaning the rulers, know better than me about who is truly deserving of charitable giving. Ibn Jarir was not just a scholar in Islamic sciences, but also a well-rounded scientist, mathematician, linguist, and medical practitioner. His student Abdul Aziz At-Tabari said that Ibn Jarir had studied logic, calculus, algebra, and many other areas of mathematics. He also studied the field of medicine and delved deeply into medicine and treatment. Ibn Jarir was undoubtedly a mujtahid, a faqih. He studied the other madhahib and excelled in the usul, or the foundations of jurisprudence. Ibn Taymiyyah even mentioned that he was from the last of the major mujtahideen in Islam. He was an avid writer when it came to ulum ash-Shari'iyyah, meaning the legislated knowledge in the religion. In fact, As-Samsami said about Ibn Jarir al-Tabari, مكث 40 سنة يكتب في كل يوم منها 40 ورقة. He spent 40 years writing 40 pages per day. The first book that he wrote was اختيار من أقاويل الفقهاء, the book that's also famously known as اختلاف الفقهاء. His books were famous, and the scholars had considered his books to be of the highest value. Abu Hamid al-Safara'ini said that if a person traveled to China just to get possession of the tafsir of Muhammad ibn Jarir, then that wouldn't be considered too much or an overexertion. This book of tafsir that we have today is only a sample of what Imam At-Tabari could have written in tafsir. Al-Qadi Abu Amr al-Simsar and Ibn Aqil al-Warraq both mentioned that Abu Ja'far al-Tabari once asked his students, "Should I write a book on tafsir?" And so they said to him, "How big would it be?" He said 30,000 folios. So they replied in shock. The person would have to spend his entire life until he dies before he completes this. Summarize it to around 3,000 folios. Then he asked them, "Should I write a book about history from the time of Adam alayhi salam to our time now?" They said, "And how big would it be?" So he gave a similar number as the first time, around 30,000 folios, which is about 60,000 pages back and front. And they gave him the same answer. Ibn Jarir said that the idea for writing his tafsir, Jami' Bayan an Ta'wil al-Quran, he had this idea when he was young. He prayed istikhara, asking Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to aid him to achieve what he intended. And he did this for 3 years before he started writing it. Ibn Jarir wrote his tafsir and his tarikh for scholars and researchers. He included the asanid, or the chains of narration, so that the scholars of his time and the ones who would come after would research and study the issues and not just base a hukum or a ruling on what they had read. This is why he included the chains of narration in a discussion of the various positions, their evidences, wajh al-istidlal, or how the statements were used as evidence or to be used as evidence for a particular position, he would argue the strength and the weakness of these positions, and then he would give a determination or the position that he deemed to be the most correct view, or the position that he had taken on that issue. So this is why sometimes he would include the chain of narrations that were weak or fabricated, because they were used by others, and that he would discuss their authenticity. Sometimes he wouldn't mention the name of the sheikh or the teacher that he narrated from, and he did this around 1,140 times in his tafsir. The faqih and muhaddith Abu al-Hasan Abdullah ibn al-Mughallis said that no one had authored a book of history and spoke about it in the way that At-Tabari had done. His book is unique in having no comparison to its virtue and intellect. Ibn Jarir had compiled much of the different aspects of the religion and worldly studies in around 5,000 folios. While he is famous for his Tarikh al-Rusul wal-Muluk, he also wrote another book in history, specifically related to the way of the Muhaddithin. This book is called Al-Muntakhab min Dhayl al-Mudhayyal, around 1,000 folios or so, in around 1,000 folios. He authored many books, as documented by his biographers. These books were written by a scholar who was described as being an Imam in Tafsir, an Imam in Hadith, an Imam in Tarikh or history, an Imam in Lugha or language, Nahu, grammar, and so on and so forth. Even in many other dunyawi or worldly sciences like medicine, sociology, and science. Yet today, many people incorrectly read his books and do not properly understand what Ibn Jarir had intended or presented in his books because they do not approach the book in the way that he had intended. For instance, the Rafida today will often cite Tarikh At-Tabari as a means to justify their interpretations and falsifications of history and what occurred during the time of the Sahaba. However, Imam At-Tabari, he had kept the chains of narration so that these statements could be verified and studied, and he recorded what was said so that the scholars of Hadith could study the chains and events. For instance, Ibn Jarir recorded the stories of the Fitnah that occurred between the Sahaba from the narrations of Abi Mikhnaf Lut ibn Yahya, who was a Rafidi, and his narrations were rejected. Yet he included it for the purpose of study and documentation of what was said around the issues in history. Abu Muhammad al-Farghani said that when Ibn Jarir started writing his book Tadhib al-Athar, he started with the authentic narrations of Abu Bakr as-Siddiq radiallahu anh. He discussed each hadith from the perspective of its various chains of narration and the ilal or the complexities of the chains of narration. And then he discussed the hadith from perspective of fiqh and sunan and the differences of opinion of the ulama of the Salaf and their evidences and how they use this hadith as an evidence. And then he discussed the meanings and the gharib or the obscurities that were related to it. He completed this for the 10 Sahaba that were promised Jannah, then Ahlul Bayt and their Mawali, and then finally the narrations of Ibn Abbas radiallahu ta'ala anhum in a juz. Then he passed away before completing it. Yaqoot Al-Hamawi said that this is a book that the scholars after him excused themselves from authoring something similar to it, or even completing it, out of the sheer difficulty of doing it justice. Ibn Kathir regarded this book as one of his best works that had nothing like it authored by anyone else. Ibn Khuzaymah, the author of Kitab al-Tawheed, once said to Abu Bakr ibn Baluya, "Word has reached me that you copied down the tafsir of Muhammad ibn Jarir." Ibn Baluya said, "Yes, I wrote it from him by dictation." So Ibn Khuzaymah said, "All of it?" Ibn Baluya replied, "Yes." So Ibn Khuzaymah asked him, "And what year was this?" He said, "From the year 83 to 90, meaning from 283 Hijri to 290 Hijri." So Ibn Khuzaymah borrowed the book from Ibn Baluya and he returned it to him after a few years and said to him, "I read it from beginning to end. I don't know anyone on the face of the earth more knowledgeable than Ibn Jarir, even though the Hanabila had oppressed him." This is because the Hanabila had prevented people from going to him and listening to him during the Fitnah in Baghdad.
يا أبا جعفر مويت حميدا غير وان في الجد والتشمير بين أجر على اجتهاد موفور وسعي إلى التقى مشكور